Good morning, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, New Fungicides for the New Year, presented by PBI-Gordon and taught by Jim Kerns, Ph.D. My name's Lisa Wick. I'm the Senior Manager of E-Learning Programs and will be today's moderator. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before I turn it over to Jim. We are recording today's event, and access to that recording will be sent as part of the follow-up email. Your audio is muted in this system, but we encourage you to ask questions as we go along. You can use the raise hand button on the GoToWebinar control panel, and I can unmute you. Or you can type questions into the question answer box if you would choose to do it that way. Your control panel, if it's minimized, you'll see a little narrow strip with an orange rectangle at the top. Click on that. That will open up the panel where you can type into the question answer box. You're also then able to download the handout of today's materials that's available to you there. Today's session is eligible for GCSAA external education points. At the end of the program, we'll give you a code to use at the association's website. We hope you find today's webinar valuable. It's brought to us in partnership with PBI-Gordon. With a full line of herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, growth regulators, and other products, PBI-Gordon Corporation is a national leader in the professional turf and ornamental management industry. We thank them for their support. Jim Kerns, Ph.D., is an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Plant Pathology at North Carolina State University. He earned his bachelor's from NC State, master's from Texas A&M University, and a Ph.D. in plant pathology from North Carolina State University. Kerns' extension efforts focus on educating turfgrass managers on disease identification, employing control measures that are efficacious, cost-effective, and environmentally sound, and fungicide resistance management. His research program focuses on summer stress management of creeping bentgrass, etiology and management of ultradwarf bermudagrass diseases, and nematode biology and management. Kerns has taught both seminars and webinars for GCSAA. Please join me in welcoming today's presenter, Jim Kerns, Ph.D. Jim?
All right. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks to everybody who's online today, and thank you to GCSAA and PBI-Gordon for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about some of these new fungicides. So as Lisa mentioned, looking at these new products today, and just to give you a little overview or a little reminder. Now, this is almost a whole nother workshop in itself, and I think Dr. Lattin still teaches this. And those of you on, if you haven't taken that class from Dr. Lattin, the Principles of Fungicides, I would highly encourage you to do so, or if not, purchase his book. And I just wanted to give this as a brief reminder that some of the main principles of fungicides as we move into these new products. Partly, I wanted to do this because there's always much excitement when new things come out. And in some cases, that excitement translates into these things doing things that they really can't in some cases. So remember that fungicides are fungistatic rather than fungicidal. So what does that mean? That essentially means if the fungus takes it up, so as it takes it up, it kills each cell that it migrates back in. So what that essentially means is fungi are actually pretty smart organisms, and they have the ability to recognize that toxin and pump it out. So they're not eradicants. In other words, that even though we may say that typically we get 21 to 28 days of control, if the environment is conducive for fungicide depletion and disease activity, then the disease can reoccur, right? So just remember that they're designed to stop, right, the growth of the pathogen and not eliminate it, okay? Two, as many of you probably know, one of the reasons we talk so much about preventative control And understanding why that is and why we ask the GCSAA and the chapters and the USGA for funding to understand how fungi grow is because of this principle. If a fungus isn't actively growing, it does not matter how much fungicide you bathe it in, it will not kill it. Okay? And this has to do with this cell wall. Fungi are unique in that they have a really contained system and they push all their efforts forward. So everything goes forward in its growth and dissolves this cell wall. This is the point of entry for fungicides. So hence, part of today is to show you where we know, like for certain diseases, where we think this opportunity is, okay? So for example, this time of year, especially in North Carolina, as we've finally gotten cold, people will ask, well, what does this winter hold for diseases? Well, next to nothing in any winter, because this cell wall of fungi is very, very tough. We can store fungi at minus 112 degrees Fahrenheit. And I think that is absolutely critical to understand. Fungicides only last about 14 to 21 days, and they're completely gone when temperatures are above 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so if we get more than 21 days of control, it's not due to the residual of the fungicide. And this is a critical one in that more fungicide will be required to achieve adequate control under certain conditions. All right. Sorry, I got a little lost there a second. So what's the outline for today? Basically, what are these new fungicides? Some of the diseases that we're going to cover. Some of these, as you'll notice, we'll go through pretty quick some of the slides because it's pretty cut and dry. Others, not so much. And then want to make sure that you are aware of some of this, watering in for root diseases, so on and so forth, and some of the work that we've been doing with this. So on the right-hand side here, this is Pythium root rot, taken, I think, about June 12th of last year. So showing you how bad, this can be at our facility. Now this one, I actually borrowed this slide from Dr. Lane Treadway. He presented this at our research symposium that we do every other year at NC State. And he did a really, really great job of highlighting new turfgrass fungicides. And that's what we asked him to do, to say, how has this market changed? And if you can look into your crystal ball, what do you see as the future? And, one of the things I get as I travel all over is people say, there's really nothing new. And that's not true. Since 2008, right? In 2008, we had 14 modes of action. In 2018, we now have 16 modes of action. 2 new modes of action in a 10-year period is really, really unique in this day and age. And I don't think people really think about it in that kind of sense. Now, the reason I think this happens is because, yes, there may not have been something new for, a particular disease, but there's a lot of new modes of action, or there are 2 new modes of action. And when you consider it takes almost $300 million now to bring a new product to market, this is some pretty outstanding development. Look at in 2018, we had 29 active ingredients. As of 2018, we have 40, and more are coming, folks. As I look and do more of this testing, more and more are showing up as numbered products. And then moreover, look at the unique AI combinations. So these are unique, not the ones like everybody says, well, everybody's got a mixture with tebuconazole or a mixture with a QOI. These are unique. In particular, I think Syngenta is launching some new, very unique AI combinations at the show next week. So point is there's a lot of new products out here. And really, this webinar would have to be like, 2 to 3 hours long to cover all of them. So I'm just picking a select few here. So, a couple of the ones we'll cover, Syngenta, of course, in 2018 released Posterity, Secure Action, Appear 2, more coming. This year at GIS, PBI-Gordon has had Tekken, Pedigree. They had Union registered last fall, which is the mixture of Segway and azoxystrobin. New Farm had Traction, which is the mixture of fluazanam and tebuconazole. BASF released a totally new DMI last fall, Maxtima and Navicon. Many of you might have already used this product. Rayora is one coming from FMC that they're launching at the golf show this year. And as I've already mentioned, there's more coming. Stay tuned. There's some in the pipeline from Bayer, Syngenta, all kinds of, in FMC, new numbered products that we've been looking at in our field research program. Now, I thought I'd start with a foliar disease and just go ahead and look at dollar spot. And of course, as many of you know, no academic is going to miss the opportunity to talk about something they did. And just so you're aware of this dollar spot model that was developed by myself and Damon Smith. I did this when I was at the University of Wisconsin, and Damon happened to be a turfgrass pathologist at Oklahoma State at the time. Both of us were in graduate school together here at NC State, and when we both moved to our first positions, we said, we think there's a better way to predict this particular disease. So the model itself accurately predicts dollar spot when temperatures are between 55 and 95. The reason we use those two temperatures is because we know from some greenhouse and inoculation work that the fungus isn't really growing at those below or above those temperatures, and we had almost no infection when we did inoculation assays. Average relative humidity has to be 70% for 5 consecutive days. And through multiple efforts of Oklahoma, Wisconsin, New Jersey, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and Mississippi State, this model has been validated. So it has been used in, I should say, Connecticut as well by Dr. John Nguaziata. What we have found is that on average it saves 1 to 2 fungicide applications. And more importantly, since it accurately predicts when the fungus is starting to grow, it's a perfect way to prevent this disease. So to get the most, I think, out of your fungicides, and in turn, help you adjust, if you so choose, your reapplication intervals. So essentially how this was done is we set out plots and we counted spots every day, right? So you see these colors here represented a day. So we never counted them again, and we could correlate that development to weather patterns from an on-site weather station. So a pretty unique way to do it, but it worked very, very well in this case. So this model is unique because from other models is it actually allows you to pick what threshold do you want. Now, what does this mean? So this is essentially the risk for disease, and it means how much risk are you willing to take. So if you look at these two panels here, A and B, right, and I'm going to focus on the 20% because that's the default if you go to use this with the sites I'll show you, Wisconsin, the Greenkeeper app, or Syngenta, right? And if you'll notice, 20% risk was always similar to a 14-day calendar-based application, right? There was no statistical difference between that. Now, if you're willing to accept a little bit more risk, so 25, 30%, you'll notice in year A, it was no different than not treating. right? It was only 3 applications here. However, in some years, you'll notice it was statistically better than a non-treated control. Point being is it allows the practitioner to select, what am I most interested in? And people are refining this model now to think maybe 25 to 30% is the target if those of you out there were so fortunate to replant to a resistant dollar spot variety of creeping bentgrass, like, Declaration or Memorial or whatever else may be out there on the market, okay? And you'll notice even the 20% each year saved at least 1 application. And some years it saved 3, and year B, this must have been a very severe dollar spot year, it didn't save any, okay? So just to keep you abreast of what this model is. So how does this work? Okay, so if you go to whatever site that I'll show you on the next slide, this is a theoretical model, but if this is the output from the Smith-Kerns model here, right? Once we get to this 20% probability mark, you make your first application, whatever it might be. This box, this is picked by you. Do you want to try to go 28 days? Do you want to go 21, 14? Whatever it is, this is what you would select. Let's just pretend this is maybe your first application of the year, and this is something that would be like posterity or exemplar or, some mixture of a SDHI, DMI, to get a very long window here. So we picked 28 days. You'll notice that the model keeps going up, and because you prevented the disease, you ignore it, right? Until you start to get near the end of your window. And you'll notice, if you're so lucky, in this case, the threshold dropped below 20%, and so you actually extended the interval by 2 to 3 days, okay? So I hope people see how this is can be beneficial for them. Now, where can you find this? There's a number of places. Dr. Paul Koch has it up on his website. So you see the URL right here. Best way I do this is just, even though this used to be my website at one time, I still don't know the name of it. So I just type in UW Turfgrass Diagnostic Lab into Google. You can also sign up here at this Greenkeeper app, which has downloaded the model, and like Syngenta's website, I'll show you in a minute, this one sends you notifications, right? So it'll tell you, hey, you made this application last and you're getting near the end of that application for the model, right? Something else to consider. And then, of course, Syngenta has also adapted this into their Greencast website. So what I did here on the site is I just went, again, I just type in Syngenta Greencast dollar spot model and put in, this is my home zip code. And I took dates from last year just to show you of how they did this. So they have low risk. So, you should maybe be thinking about preventative applications, then you get into a moderate, maybe apply to get it out, and then an elevated and a high. And you'll notice last year, prior to May 1st, we probably should have already had something down. And indeed, for us in Raleigh, we need to get out, about April 1st to get ahead of this particular disease. So just showing you where you can find this material. Why do I say that? Because if you are preventive with all of these materials I'm going to show you, it's really the best way because you're going to get the best bang for your buck for these new materials. So here was one, traction, which I mentioned is the mixture of fluazanam and tebuconazole. It's going to give you phenomenal dollar spot control and brown patch control as we looked in this trial. Now, you might be saying, well, this isn't new. Well, this was before it was even registered in 2017. So just pulling back some data that we looked at. Another one I guess I failed to mention early on is, it's been out a little bit, but Pinpoint, which is a QOI fungicide, mandistroben. Very interesting in that it's a nice dollar spot material, but unlike other QOIs, it doesn't provide brown patch control. So that's one of the important things I think of today is, even though you may have the same class of chemistry, it doesn't necessarily mean they all have the same control spectrum. And that slide early on of showing you, 70 unique AI combinations, it really shows that you need to understand some of these particular products and do your homework, because there's a lot out there. And it just as a comparison, we always have standards in. If you look at Exemplar, providing good control of both dollar spot and brown patch here. So I want to move on to another study that we did, because this was part of the goal of this webinar, is to talk about water volumes. So we looked at BASF's new product, Maxtima, right? It's a DMI. And we looked at it at multiple water volumes from 0.5 gallons per 1,000 square feet of water in the tank to 2 gallons. And interestingly enough, we saw no difference in control with Maxtima. Provided exceptional dollar spot control, whether we applied it in 0.5 gallon per 1,000 or 1 gallon per 1,000. Now, I want you to keep in mind, those of you out there doing this, that when we spray these trials, this is a single nozzle on a 3 by 6 foot plot. So we are getting exceptional coverage, right? And if you're getting good coverage, then in terms of this active ingredient, the water volume didn't matter all that much. Now let's contrast that with Secure. Even though at the high water volume at 2 gallons, it still provided good dollar spot control, right? You'll notice it was better at 1 gallon and 0.5 gallon, okay? This makes sense because it's a contact fungicide. We don't want it getting past where that organism may be. And more important, we don't want to dilute it any. So I think based on this work, one of the piece of bad news I may have is, yes, we do need to think about foliar disease control differently than the disease control of root diseases. And I think that's one of the biggest things to come to grips with, in that I think we can target, as I'll show you later, 1 gallon to a 1.5 gallons as your overall water volume. But some will not be watered in, and some will be watered in, okay? The other thing I want you to notice is, even at 0.5 gallon, when we mixed a contact with a wetting agent, we started to lose some control, okay? And I think that's really important, because I know many folks out there are tank mixing, that, it still was good, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't as good as the 0.5 gallon by itself. So we also need to be cautious of what we may be mixing with these fungicides.
And at this point, Jim, I want to interject with the label is the law, and you have to
Right.
go by those amounts. Sometimes you researchers do different things, but as practitioners, our audience has to know the label for where they are located.
Correct. And one of the issues with the label is they're always really fuzzy on the water volume. So they're really good with rates, but sometimes not as good with how they should be applied. So just showing you some of the photos here, I mean, a picture's worth 1,000 words when you look at the amount of disease we had. Look at Secure, Maxtima here at the different water volumes, just fantastic dollar spot control. So the beauty here is we're adding a DMI back into the mix that's pretty cost effective for those of you who might be managing dollar spot. Showing you another trial here where we looked at very similar control and really, at Secure performed well, Maxtima performed well, just showing you in our mountains in North Carolina. And this is interesting because we do have some courses in the mountains of North Carolina that had some documented DMI insensitivity, and Maxtima performed quite well. So just to keep that in mind as we go through this. Showing you the photos from this particular trial as well, Maxtima performing very, very well. Now, I'm going to come back to the DMI sensitivity issue in just a minute, but I wanted to introduce a product called Rayora. So this is coming, and many of you may see this if you're attending the show next week. FMC is going to be talking about this DMI, or flutriafol. And for us, it has performed very, very well for dollar spot control. Now, this is a little bit of a confusing slide, but what we mean by pre is there was no disease there. 10 spots, so we allowed disease to develop, and you'll notice we had some curative control of Rayora, and we allowed even more to develop. At 20 spots, once again, we saw curative control. That was similar to posterity here. So I think this is very exciting because it's adding another product into the mix. Now, I don't think I have the slides in here, but I was going to show you, at least with Maxtima, that the beauty of these two new DMIs is we don't see any adverse effects to applying. In other words, we tend to use the word growth regulation, but I like to use just phytotoxicity. We don't see any yellowing, thinning on bent or bermudagrass associated with Rayora or Maxtima. This is really nice because it adds in a whole nother component. Now, many of you may be familiar with really the first one that came out, Brisquet or difenconazole, was very similar, right? We were able to apply it up to 105 degrees on creeping bentgrass and not see any issue. So it's adding new tools into the toolbox. Showing you here the Rayora pre, providing good dollar spot control, like posterity, despite the pressure that we have. So again, another nice product to come in. Just another one here, Rayora, providing very, very good control. And you'll notice there is a rate response, okay, that we're seeing better control. And I should preface this with, this is dollar spot on a Crenshaw fairway in Raleigh, North Carolina. So very, very extreme pressure when we see this. All right, and I want to make sure that is very, very clear, because anytime we replicate these studies, like in the mountains of North Carolina, we even get better control than we may see in Raleigh, okay? Now, some of you probably have very quickly might have seen this fame. This is a QOI, right? Many of you know fluoxystrobin, and you're probably saying, well, what's going on here? Well, it's a high rate, number one. And some of the QOIs, Fame and Insignia, are halfway decent on dollar spot. Would I recommend them? No, but know that you may be getting some other control out there. And just showing you some of these plots here, right? A little bit in here, not much when you consider the pressure that we get at our research facility, okay? So, sorry to flip-flop back and forth some, but get back to Maxtima. This isn't necessarily to show you disease control, more so than this was a study done at a club in North Carolina called Roaring Gap. Really interesting club in that it's about 2.5 hours from us here in Raleigh, but it's about 3,900 feet, I think, of elevation. They have a whole conglomerate of grasses in their fairways, bent, poa, some fescue, some bluegrass, Kentucky bluegrass. Very good location to actually see if there'd be any phytotoxicity. So Navicon, which I haven't mentioned yet, is Maxtima mixed with Insignia. And each one of these treatments, we looked at it in conjunction with a growth regulator. And you'll notice, here's the acceptable line here. We had no adverse effects on turf quality. And, you know, statistically, it never showed up. But based on my eye, when Maxtima or Navicon were mixed with Primo, the plots looked a lot better. Moreover, it provided exceptional dollar spot control. Now, we didn't quite get the pressure that is normally occurs up there, but still provided exceptional control, regardless of the rate at 0.4 or 0.8 in this case. Now, this is the study I really wanted to highlight because some of these newer DMIs are interesting in that, and some of you may have heard this already from BASF, that Maxtima has a different binding style or pattern or dynamic, I guess. And as such, isolates may be more inherently sensitive, okay? So we looked at this at a site, this was up in the mountains of North Carolina, that had documented DMI insensitivity. And really, in truth, this particular location didn't get great control out of DMIs. And you'll notice we saw that with Torque here and Turney, not seeing great control in this at this location. Now the banner rate is a little bit higher at 1.5, and we did see good control. What was fascinating is we saw exceptional control with Maxtima at 0.4 and, you know, good control at 0.2. And more importantly is this was at a 21-day interval, okay? So we were pretty excited about this and wanted to know why this might be. So here's the Maxtima rate at 0.4. You notice I don't think anybody would consider that acceptable, given, you know, what you would like to get out of it, and then our control here. So what is going on at this particular location? So we asked that question and looked at it in vitro. So these are the different concentrations of the active ingredient, so propiconazole here, in the plates. We had sensitive isolates and those that were deemed as insensitive from previous work, and isolates collected from this location. You'll notice at 0.1 part per million, we had really good growth with the insensitive compared to the sensitive. And, you know, even still some growth at 1 part per million. Now, for a DMI, somewhere around 1 part per million is what could be considered the dose that you would look for resistance. So could show some resistance here. Torque, we saw very similar, 0.1, very good growth of the fungus, and still some growth even at 1. Now at 10 parts per million, they're all shut down, showing, I think, what you saw in that previous slide, that if we got banner up to a higher rate, we still got good control, okay? This would also highlight, by the way, excuse me, oh, excuse me, that we may need to tighten the interval some to see good control. Now, what about the Maxtima? You'll notice very similar control or suppression of growth at 0.1, maybe a little bit more here, but no growth at 1. So the interesting thing with this is, because it's a new DMI, number one, the population has not seen it, and two, it may have a novel binding mechanism. This could help those of you who may have some populations that are insensitive. Now, here's something I need to preface. This doesn't mean that we go out and overuse it, of course. We still need to rotate in SDHIs and, of course, contacts like Daconil or Secure to prevent this, the dollar spot pathogen from developing resistance to this chemistry. Now we're looking at this for Rayora, and it seems like it may also have a very similar property. One of the other goals of today's workshop was to really talk about how to use these best. And I know on a tweet I saw from PBI-Gordon of looking at preventative versus curative. So this was a study that we looked at last year where we allowed dollar spot to develop. You can see here up above, this is the output of the Smith-Kerns model from Syngenta Greencast. So a lot of disease activity. And as such, we had 30% on average disease in each 3 by 6 foot plot. What does that mean? Basically, they were too numerous to count individual spots, so we didn't bother. We just rated the amount affected. Sprayed some good products here like Secure, Daconil, Maxtima, Posterity, and Posterity is the purple line, and it's disappeared for some reason, but that's okay. What I want you to notice is we made applications on May 13th, and we didn't get close to 0 until May 31st. So what this means is, yes, all the companies are looking for curative suppression of diseases, but you have to keep in mind that curative suppression is dictated by what you are doing as far as management. What is your fertility program, your growth regulation, all of that. That in some cases, it could take time. If you make an application, think about yourself. If you get disease developed on March 13th, what we typically see happen is may come back the 21st or 23rd, right? And then maybe even again. And then people say, well, it was the last one that controlled it. And just showing you here that, you know, Maxtima and Posterity, which is the purple line, ended up getting dollar spot under control. It just took 2 weeks. Now you may be wondering up here with Secure and Daconil, what's going on? Well, they're contacts. Remember, if disease is already developed, a contact by itself will not give you curative control. You have to mix in something that gets inside of the plant. So just a couple things to keep in mind when you're using these new products. They are fantastic, but they have their limitations. So showing you here, right, Posterity at 0.32 and the Maxtima, I mean, they look really, really good at the end of this trial. But the contacts, if we were preventative, especially with Secure, I mean, it would be flawless dollar spot control, right? Once again, reiterating the point of using something like the model or staying ahead of the disease to get the best bang for your buck. For us, Secure has performed well on a 21-day interval in our pressure, which to me is just pretty remarkable when you think about that. All right, let's move on. And I should add, those of you, as Lisa mentioned up front, if there's a question, something is confusing, raise your hand or put it in the chat box, and you know, Lisa will stop me to answer those questions. So what about brown patch and gray leaf spot? Looking at Rayora. One of the interesting things with Rayora is I've already mentioned very, you know, good to strong dollar spot material. But what distinguishes it from, let's say, a Maxtima is it also provides exceptional brown patch suppression, okay? And we look at this in our trials. Last year, we had a lot of brown patch develop in our creeping bentgrass fairway situation, and it performed very, very well. So once again, you know, I don't like comparing products, but the way I look at it is more from a programmatic approach. If you think of using Maxtima maybe early when we don't have brown patch pressure, and then you rotate to something like a secure or an exemplar. And then in the middle of summer, potentially you could come back to a Rayora, and that would give you brown patch suppression, right? So that's kind of how I've been thinking about this, because again, you know, something like posterity, you know, phenomenal dollar spot control, but it's not bringing anything to the table in terms of brown patch. So we do need to think of a programmatic approach when developing these programs. Now, one of the exciting things for us in North Carolina is in the past few years, I think in the Mid-Atlantic and other areas, I think even Dr. Koch said last year gray leaf spot was trying to inch its way into Wisconsin. That we've been actively looking at gray leaf spot because it's become more of a problem in our tall fescue sod production in lawns. So we had Rayora there, and you'll notice the bar isn't even showing up. So we had really good suppression of gray leaf spot. Now, admittedly, we didn't quite have the banner year that we normally do, but what I'm not showing you here on this was a big trial. There were other products that failed, right? That were no different than the non-treated control. I only highlighted the ones that actually worked well. And it highlights, for example, look at Headway, right? Shows what you're getting when we're mixing two different active ingredients, right? That providing good, you know, brown patch and gray leaf spot control. Navicon, another new product, did the same thing. And these weren't statistically different, but I mean, these three plots here were really next to flawless in this particular trial. So showing you some other diseases here. Now, to finish up, I'm going to switch totally out of foliar diseases and move towards root diseases. And as I mentioned, those of you listening on, there's no way I could cover everything. And being in North Carolina, we're going to cover diseases that we see most frequently. And one of the things we have focused a lot on in our research program here is how these fungicides move in the root zone. And this particular slide is showing you something called a KOC value. This is the fungicide's ability to stick to organic carbon. Most of our fungicides are classified as moderate to very high. So, you know, if you look at these, there are differences from tebuconazole to Balaton to azoxystrobin, you know, to the lowest that we found is mefenoxam or Subdue Max, right? The key thing is they're all moderate, okay? In other words, these fungicides are not designed to move, right? They're designed to stick. One of the lessons I use here is, remember, turf is a very small player in terms of the development market. So fungicides, in many cases, in other areas, are applied by crop duster, irrigation, you know, sprayers that are well above the canopy, right? They're not, for us, we do things actually quite well, 18 inches above the canopy, right? To a immensely dense canopy. So our biggest challenge is how do we get these materials to their target site? And that's some of the things we've been researching, and that's what I want to cover here before talking about specific control of the other diseases. Now, this is work done by a former master's student in my program, Wendell Hutchins, who has now moved on to work with Dr. David McCall for his PhD at Virginia Tech. We looked at the influence of post-application irrigation on the movement of, in this case, of myclobutanil. We picked a couple fungicides, and these were fungicides that we could either purchase radio-labeled material, or in this case, Corteva donated myclobutanil, so thank you very much to them. We looked at different irrigation amounts. So in other words, this was on a 90% sand, 10% peat. There was no turf in this system. And we looked at different irrigation amounts of no irrigation, an eighth, quarter, half, and 1 inch. So I want to draw your attention to 0 to 1 inches here. You'll notice even at an inch of irrigation immediately after the application, we still are retaining almost 50% of the active ingredient in the top 1 inch of soil. This isn't even including thatch and turf, okay? We had no detection of any fungicide in any of these studies below 4 inches, okay? But if you'll notice, we did see differences. So at at an eighth of an inch, we're seeing more material accumulating at this 1 to 2 inch depth. And what's really nice is there's really no statistical differences amongst these depths or amongst these treatments. So it looks like somewhere between an eighth to a quarter of an inch is that sufficient irrigation amount to maximize control of root diseases. So something very similar here with tebuconazole, and I don't want to belabor this, other than initially, yes, we may need upwards of a quarter of an inch, okay, because tebuconazole is fairly immobile here, right? So there could be even subtle differences amongst treatments. Now, as I tell a lot of my students, it's really sad when one slide can summarize their entire thesis, and I think this summarizes it really well, where we had creeping bentgrass here inoculated with summer patch, and this is non-inoculated. Okay, so if you look at no irrigation with propiconazole, a tenth to an eighth to a quarter, really highlighting the fact of these next slides. Looking at the efficacy of these fungicides, they have to be watered in. And really, in truth, watered in immediately after the application to get the best bang for their buck, okay? And that sweet spot is somewhere between an eighth and a quarter of an inch. Now, if you'll allow me just a second to jump on a soapbox, you need to figure out what an eighth of an inch is. At our site at Lake Wheeler, that's about 6 minutes. So depending on your particular setup, need to calculate how much that is. And I think you'll see an improvement in the control from some of these particular products. Now, this particular figure is highlighting some work that was done by and funded through Rounds for Research. So those of you out there who support that, thank you very much. In the Carolinas, they gave us a nice sum of money that has supported a Ph.D. student, Cam Stevens, for 3 years. And we've looked at 3 different active ingredients so far: pyraclostrobin, balaton or tridemophan, and penthiopyrad or Valista. Couple important things that we take away from this is, the nice thing is this little green sliver that you can barely see is what is in the clippings. So we are not removing all that much from the clippings. But I think the biggest thing that you'll notice is look at the stark difference between watering in immediately and waiting to water in, right? Especially at this 0 to 1 inch depth, or it's listed up here as in centimeters as 0 to 2.5. So the point is, if you're going to manage these soil-borne diseases, water them in immediately with somewhere between an eighth to a quarter of an inch. We saw the exact same thing here with Segway, right, or Cyazofamid. This is 0 to waiting 6 hours. Look at the dramatic difference here of what's getting in, okay? So absolutely important that we water these things in immediately after application. Now, some folks have asked, well, what about wetting agents? And we have found that, yes, wetting agents do help facilitate fungicide movement, but the key thing that we saw is they take 2 weeks to work. So in other words, we can't just simply mix the fungicide, right, you have to do almost a pre-treatment, right, of 2 weeks out in order to maximize the movement of these products. We picked 3 different penetrant wetting agents and we saw no differences. And there is more coming on this. An article engulfed them. If you want to read more about this, this happens to be, again, some of Wendell's master's work. So I want to get to this real quick. This is basically all we've talked about, and I wanted you to have this if you want to come back. These are basically the conclusions and suggestions here, okay? So let's get into some of these particular diseases to finish up. Spring dead spot, okay? I'm going to skip this one to get to some of the images. We found a few years ago and others across the country that posterity worked very, very well in our trials. If you look at the non-treated control here, and even better than Ballista. One of the key things we've noticed is in some cases we may need more than 2 applications. And I'm going to talk about this with soil temperature because that's what it has to deal with here. In some cases, our window may get bigger for spring dead spot control. In other years, it actually may get smaller, okay? One interesting thing we started to notice with some of these newer products, and this came to me from 2 golf courses in North Carolina, is look at some of these, I guess, health effects of this product. Right now, we noticed this some time ago with DMIs and dormant bermudagrass, but seeing this with the SDHI is pretty cool. That, in other words, the dormant bermudagrass is retaining that color better. It's probably knocking down other secondary pathogens. In both places have indicated the density of this turf is better than this over here. So you're getting kind of a side benefit by looking at some of these new products out there. So if these happen to be cost effective, that's something to consider. Now, Kubota is another one. It's a little bit older, but I wanted to remind people of the exceptional control we've seen with this other SDHI from PBI-Gordon, providing fantastic control. Now, one of the key things that PBI kind of brought to our attention, I don't know if it was intentionally or inadvertently, is you'll notice this was on a 21-day interval. Typically, we've done spring dead spot on a 28-day interval, but I'll show you why I think this may be important, at least for us in the Carolinas or transition zone, in just a few slides. Once again, highlighting Kubota, showing you really good control, as well as Tekin. Now, Tekin is the mixture of Kubota and tebuconazole. Now, you might be saying, what's that for? Well, it's bringing in, take all root rot, for example, and potentially an added benefit for fairy ring control. So important to think about that when you're picking some of these products of, what your targets are. And I always advocate, anytime you're doing this is, write out your targets. Okay, this particular slide is a little bit busy, but just highlighting, this is 100% control, this line. Look at the products that are getting us close to that. Maxtima, Kubota, the higher rate of Kubota here, right? Providing, very, very good spring dead spot control. Posterity at the high rate is also almost getting us there, as well as Navicon. Now, once again, I hope you saw our pressure, which my philosophy is I try to induce the absolute worst disease possible. So keep that in mind when you go through this. And we have 1/8 of an inch of water here, okay, that immediately after application. So number of products here for spring dead spot control. Here is the key, is targeting when this organism is growing best. And this was a picture taken from Wendell Hutchins' work at Virginia Tech. that we have to target somewhere between a 75-degree soil temperature, and we have to get the last one out before temperatures dip below 55, or we're not going to get adequate control, okay? And just to facilitate in terms of time here, I'm going to pull this up to get through this, because I want to get to this one. This was our soil temperature some years ago in North Carolina in 2018, showing you this window, right? And again, these products are great if you are monitoring this at your own facility and understanding those conditions. Why is it so important? Because these new products are not like Rubigan, right? One of the interesting things, again, that Lane highlighted is Rubigan stuck around a long time. These new products are fantastic, probably better when you actually think of the rate that's being used, but they don't stick around as long. So we need to get them into that soil temperature window in order to have the most effect. Now, this is just showing you around the country that there could be regional differences. And I'm going to skip that in order to get to this take-all root rot here. So what are we looking at for take-all root rot, or what used to be called bermudagrass decline? These are all the same. Now, myself, I've gravitated more towards take-all root rot because that's really what it is. It's more of a root rot than rather a decline. These are what the symptoms look like here, and they can coalesce into much bigger patches like you see on this slide. And what works? So DMIs have been very effective, if you notice here with Mirage, and we've been targeting the same timing as of spring dead spot, watered in with 1/8 of an inch of water. Mirage worked well. Tartan has been one of the gold standards, and that worked very well. Lexicon has also performed well. And if you look here, Navicon, so the mixture of Maxtima and Insignia, also very, very good. Borrowed this slide from Dr. Bruce Martin at Clemson, or retired from Clemson, showing Maxtima and Navicon performing very, very well in his trials too. And they look at these fall applications, and you'll notice a little bit earlier, September 13th here. And we've been really trying to understand when is the optimal timing. This was a pretty cool study we had this summer where we actually started some on August 28th. And you'll notice those were the only treatments that provided control. When we were starting the same treatments on September 25th, no control. So it really highlights the idea of getting it out preventatively. So with take-all, I think we need to start targeting about a 78 to 80 degree soil temperature window, and that's what we saw here. Not really above 80 per se, but somewhere right at this 80 degree mark, for those of you with ultradwarf bermudagrass, seems to be this sweet spot, and I think that would correlate well with what Dr. Martin saw in his trial. So Pythium root rot, I think many of you probably know that Segway has been fantastic, but keep in mind the phosphonate products, this happens to be the old code for a Peer 2, work very well, as you see in this trial. Now, getting to this one, Union is the mixture of Segway and azoxystrobin, and it performed very, very good in our trials, right? Absolutely amazing. So the nice thing here is it allows for a tank mixture and some rotation with this particular disease of root rot. One of the key things with root rot that we've been focusing on is about a 60 to 65 degree soil temperature window. So for us, that's really May 1st to May 15th.
Hey,
And
Jim, there is a
yeah,
question about those soil temperatures. What
okay.
depth are you measuring when you're talking about that?
Very good question. So the depth that we're measuring, at least in these figures, is a 4-inch depth. That's what our state climate office has out. To me, I don't think it matters all that much as long as you're consistent with what depth you're measuring. And the other key component is, remember, these are taken every like 10 to 15 minutes at these stations. So if you want a good average, you want to take it about 11 o'clock is a really good average for the day if you can't take multiple measurements. So I hope that makes sense for those of you out there listening. A very, very good question. What I want to get to the end, as you know, I tend to get a little long-winded, those of you who have listened to me before. With root diseases, prevention is critical. So this was that same or similar study that we did with Dollar Spot, and we used Segway and Union, two phenomenal products. And when disease developed, we were never able to get it under control. And I would say this is true for take-all. We know it's true for spring dead spot, that if it develops, that's where control gets the most challenging, because this is dictated by the environment. And this happens to be creeping bentgrass in Raleigh, North Carolina on July 26th. So I think you see that control can be, or recovery can be a challenge. Last little bit, fairy ring, I'm going to get through these builds real quick. Basically, adding these new products brings new fairy ring control. Maxtima and Navicon perform very well. I didn't have the data ready yet, but it looks like Rayora is also bringing fairy ring control to the table, and they're looking at posterity as well. So again, beauty of these new products is it's adding a bunch of new tools in our toolbox, okay? Key thing there was they were watered in. Some of them were with a wetting agent. So with that, we've come to the end of the time, and if you want to follow along with where we put out this work or follow up with questions afterwards, we don't hide from anybody. We put out a lot of this work every 2 to 3 weeks on our blog, on our website, that then are blasted out through Twitter and Facebook. So feel free to follow us along, and if there are any other questions, I'll be happy to take those.
Thanks, Jim. Lots of information there in a short period of time. We appreciate you sharing that research with us. If you have a question at this time, raise your hand or type those into the question answer box. PBI-Gordon, we thank as well. They have arranged for education points for this. So you will go onto the GCSA website, and your code is 999-23124-30580. To anyone listening to the recording, put in the day you're listening, not our original presentation date. We are going to have a couple of other webinars by PBI-Gordon in February and in March. We're looking forward to those. That information can be found on the GCSA website as well. The Golf Industry Show is taking place soon, the 25th through 30th of January. PBI-Gordon will have a booth. Booth number shown there on the screen if you want to stop by and say hello.
Well, thank you, Lisa, as always, and GCSAA and PBI-Gordon. Those of you, like I said, if you have any questions after you digest all I'd probably throw at you, and contact us, we'd be happy to discuss it with you. So thank you again.